Hello, I'm Dr. Bill Curtis, and this is the Ministry Think Tank. I have the privilege to serve as the lead pastor of Cornerstone Baptist Church in Florence, South Carolina, and I'm a co-founder of the Pillar Network for Church Planting. Before we begin, I want to remind my listeners that on this podcast, I am only speaking for myself as an individual Southern Baptist. I do not claim that my views are shared by anyone else, including members of my local church, other pillar churches, Southeastern Seminary, Liberty University, where I serve as an associate professor of homiletics, or other organizations with whom I'm affiliated. This is just one Baptist pastor's personal opinions. Today, I'm excited to be joined by my good friend and brother, Dr. Will Forrest, lead pastor and planting pastor of Summit Life Church in Issaquah, Washington. He's also a fellow Pillar Network pastor. Welcome, Will.
Thank you. It's a privilege to be with you today.
Yeah, it's awesome to have you on the podcast today. And we're just going to dive right in. You know, when we met, you had been serving on a church staff in Idaho for about 6 years in an associate role. And then you began shifting your focus towards church planting. It could be that someone who listens to this conversation today is in a similar space. As you think back, what motivated you to begin thinking about church planting as opposed to pursuing another position in an existing church?
Yeah, good question. There were a series of things that kind of led to us pursuing church planting. If I could summarize it with one word, it'd probably be stewardship. I feel like all of us have a responsibility to steward our lives in a way that maximizes kingdom impact and honors God with the way that we take care of our lives. And so the three things that my wife and I were considering when we were considering church planting is, how have we been gifted? What are our abilities? What opportunities and needs are out there? And what are our passions? Those three things working together, I think are meaningful. And I've watched pastors who have gift and engaged need, but they don't have passion, and it seems to lead to burnout. And so while passion is a little bit more elusive, I think in nature, we really had a passion for the mission of the gospel. And so my wife and I, in considering how to steward our lives, we were looking at talents, we were looking at gifting, we were looking at passions, and took a trip down to Las Vegas to visit a church plant, and had seen some of the stories that had come out of that church plant, was serving on staff, as you said, at this church in Idaho. And it really became obvious to us that there's a tremendous need in urban centers for gospel-centered churches. I had read a book by Ed Stetzer that identified America as the 5th largest mission field in the world, the largest in the Western Hemisphere. And so it began to lead to the conversations and prayers my wife and I had for about a year before you and I had a conversation that was providential and shaped the trajectory of our life. We really had a conversation for about a year. I was championing the mission in my teaching and in the classes that I was teaching for the church, calling the church not to simply be evangelical in name, but to be evangelistic in nature. And found, after really championing the mission of God and the Great Commission that's carried forward through the local church, that God provided a unique opportunity for our gifts and passions to be aligned with an opportunity that led us out to South Carolina to step into the residency at Cornerstone.
Well, I really like the process that you identified right there. I think it's helpful to consider if those three components are in place. We're going to talk a little later about how really hard it is to plant a church. And so you really need, I think, all of those things. Did you find that there was like one moment when, yes, you knew that's the direction that God wanted you to head? Or did it kind of just grow over time to the point where you just had a piece about it?
Yeah, I think most often in life we take the next step without knowing the full journey. And that certainly was true when it came to the story of church planting. We could see enough to take the next step, but we couldn't really see beyond that next step. And so when we were visiting Las Vegas, visiting this church plant, I literally looked over to my wife and I said, we could stay probably in our church. Wonderful people that loved us, we loved them. We could probably stay in this church for the rest of our lives, and it would be a sweet experience. Or we could do something like that, which would
Mm-hmm.
be very hard and difficult, and yet we thought rewarding when it comes to kingdom fruit. And so that led to the next step, which was just talking about it together and within kind of our small little circles. That next step led to the conversation that you and I had, that led us out to Florence, South Carolina, from Boise, Idaho, just outside Boise, Idaho, which is a long journey for a family of six.
Yeah.
We didn't go into South Carolina. We didn't know where we were going to church plant. We didn't really know what church planting looked like, but we knew that the next step was to be trained in church planting if that was the trajectory. Miami was top of our list for a number of reasons, some spiritual, some not so spiritual.
Mm-hmm.
And we took that step to explore whether Miami was the place to land, and God providentially planted us on the other side of the United States, literally. And so and I would say even in pastoring, we have vision, we see where we're going, but we don't always see how we're going to get there. And so just being obedient to that next step. Our family adopted. People often ask, how do you engage the adoption process? Just take the next step and see what the Lord providentially lays before you. And so that church planting feels similar, or at least our experience in church planting has been similar.
Now, I like that description because I think most of us who have planted churches probably approached that process in a similar way, and it really resonates with me. Before we go further, though, I want to dig a little deeper here on the family side of the decision. You mentioned Tiffany and your four children who were pretty young when y'all came to South Carolina in 2015. How did those initial conversations go with her when you were first thinking about church planting? What were her initial thoughts? And do you have anything to share that might encourage someone who's, contemplating but hasn't maybe been brave enough to have the conversation with their spouse yet about what they're thinking about? How did that process work for y'all?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories that actually come to mind. I don't know which ones are worth sharing, and don't want to linger here longer than needed. But when Tiffany and I did premarital counseling, we've known each other since we were 10 years old. So like we knew each other's stories, families, and there was a sweetness to that, and getting married young and having lived some life together. But in our premarital counseling, one thing that was just kind of absurd to me, not absurd to her, but absurd to me, was in kind of these personality assessments. She filled one out for me. I filled one out for her. We were just, lock and step the whole way, except when it came to stability. And she said I was unstable. And I was like, what? And she said, well, like you were just talking like 2 months ago about planting a church in Ireland, and now you're talking about starting a construction company. And I'm like, I'm just dreaming out loud. Like that's just what men do. We dream and we see the world and what could be. And that was helpful for me and has been really formative throughout the course of our now 19 years of marriage. Because when it came to the conversation of church planting, I knew, because we've had enough conversations that were just dreams, right? Like just recently I was saying we should buy a catamaran and sail the world. And she's like, you're an idiot. And I'm like, I know, but wouldn't that be awesome? Right. And
Okay, that sounds horrible to me, but carry
yeah,
on.
yeah,
Yeah.
categorically, that's a dream. Like that's not a plan. That's just
Right.
I don't know how to sail, and I can swim, but not in the ocean. So, anyways, so we get to the church planning conversation from Vegas back to Boise, and I looked at her. I said, "This isn't just me kind of throwing out a dream. Like, what would it really look like for us to be in a position where, if the Lord led us to church planting, that we could say yes?" And for a full year, just kind of let that linger in our prayers, let that linger in our conversations, unsure what to do with that. And it wasn't forced into a 3-day weekend where she had to come to a decision. It was this idea that was more than just kind of a crazy dream, but what would it look like? And for a year, occasionally dinner conversations or car rides or whatever. That leads to the conversation that you and I have, which meant she had a year to process what it would mean to say goodbye to her siblings. Her whole family still lives in the Treasure Valley. What would it be like to say goodbye to her parents? What it would be like to live at a distance from her nieces and nephews, and like she hasn't articulated it exactly this way, but she had a year to emotionally and mentally and spiritually process what this would look like, which made it easier when we came to the point of decision to actually make the decision. Now, I know not everyone has a year leadway, but for us that was helpful. So we get to the decision. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it was helpful.
Mm.
We commit to move to South Carolina. My wife's a twin. She's got a twin brother. She says goodbye to him the night before we hop in the Penske truck, and they both cry, which I've never really seen either of them cry. And she goes to the pantry, grabs a package of Oreos, and says, "I'm going for a drive." And I remember looking at her like, "And you're coming back, right?" So there's an emotional journey that she's on to
Yeah.
process these goodbyes, even though she's had time to process. And that drive for her, I don't know what her and the Lord talked about and what the Lord did in that drive, but she's never looked back.
Mm.
She's been bought in wherever the Lord would lead in that next step, knowing that South Carolina was a temporary stepping stone. And there are a lot of days, honestly, where things are difficult here, and she's the one that says, "Well, that's what we signed up for. Like
Yeah.
that was a decision that we made together, and that's been helpful for me." So,
Yeah,
and
I think that's great because, we tend to think in terms of the guy who's going to be a church planter, but it's a package thing. Like we're one
sure,
flesh with the wife that God gave us. And Lyle and I have often discussed and shared with potential planters and their wives that, we go as a team. Yes,
mm,
the husband is called of God to be the lead pastor in the plant, but the role of his wife in the process, the journey, and the life that they're both called to requires a mutual commitment and surrender to the Lord. And to short
yeah,
circuit that, I think,
yeah,
to try to make that happen in a weekend, as you suggested,
yeah,
I think is a disservice. I think couples should take the time necessary to reach
yeah,
that space, whatever it is, as they trust the Lord, and only move ahead if they both
yeah.
feel this is God's will for them.
Yeah, and I might add, and you can clarify or correct or even push back on this. Once the couple's made that decision, it's no longer the kids' decision. The parents are deciding, but the kids get to be invited into the process of what that looks like for their family to relocate. And our kids were young enough that obviously we're not soliciting the advice of a 4-year old, 6-year old, 8-year old, but we made the decision. We then invited them into the journey. What does it look like as a family to plant this church? And I remember my preschooler, actually in South Carolina, she's building stuff with blocks, and she says, "Hey, teacher, look, I'm building a church. I'm planting a church." And the teacher, snapped a photo and sent it to our family. And I thought, how sweet that our 4-year old sees that that's what we're doing together. My 9-year old, a little bit more aware, she was in the back seat and she said, "Dad, I know that we're like planting a church, but how?" I'm like, it's a great question. I don't actually really know the answer to that question, but how cool that you're seeing this is what we're tasked with doing. I don't know how to do that. How are we going to do that, Dad? Because this is kind of a family mission that we've signed up for, that you've signed us up for. And so for us, it was a sweet journey. Our kids love the church. They been such an important part of what we're doing, but they weren't a part of the decision making process. I don't, maybe it's different if the kids are older and life's disrupted in a different way, but I do think that God gives kids parents for a reason. And trust that if the Lord's leading the parents, that he's also leading the kids to be a part of that.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I think that's very helpful. Well, you've mentioned coming back to South Carolina. Our paths did cross providentially in 2015. Our elders had just made the decision to create a residency at Cornerstone that potential church planters could participate in. We both adjunctively teach for Liberty University School of Divinity and have for quite a while. And it was actually in that lane that I met your brother first and actually taught in his department. And he and I were just talking one day about this new residency, and I was excited about finally being able to try to invest in some church planters. And he said, "Well, you should talk to my brother. Like he's thinking about it." And of course, as you know, that put me in the horns of a huge dilemma because I'm like, okay, so my boss wants me to talk to his brother. Well, what if I don't like his brother? I mean, what if his brother doesn't like me? That feels like it's got potential for a bad outcome. But I love Ben so much. I'm like, yeah, I'll give your brother a call. We did. We talked, and God led you and Tiffany and the kids to move here to be really our first resident. We like to call you our church planting guinea pig around here because we were all figuring it out together at that time. We've talked a little bit about the fact that that was a big transition for your family. On the whole, do you feel like it was a benefit to your family and your kids to have had that experience or not?
100%, 100% beneficial. In fact, I tell people two things I say frequently. One is the best year of ministry in our life. There was a sweetness to it, to be loved and invested in a way that not as common when you're in a position where you're giving to receive like that. It was just a year of receiving blessing from Cornerstone and the elders and the staff. So our hearts were filled before we went out and stepped into this journey. Second thing that I tell people is, had we stayed another year, you could not have paid me to leave Florence, South Carolina, because of how much love our family felt for the people at Cornerstone. And there's tremendous benefit. I want to speak maybe beyond the competency benefit, which is tremendous benefit there, skill benefit, thinking about strategy and engagement, missional engagement, city, all those things, super beneficial. But I think even more than that, and probably what's not thought of when thinking about residencies and church planning, is the relational benefit. There's a relational emotional tax on a planter when they land in a community, depending on how they plant, potentially not knowing anyone, not knowing many people, building relationships in church planting. One of the guys that I asked when we planted, what advice would you give a young guy? He said, get good at saying goodbye. I didn't fully understand what he meant when he said that. Having planted now, we're 8 years into this. I think it was probably the best advice he could have given me. There's a posture of saying goodbye, especially in urban centers. People come professionally, can't afford the city, they go back home. For whatever reason, you just got to say goodbye. Like that has an emotional toll on a planter. There's complex contextualizing of gospel and ministry that has a mental emotional toll on a planter, and having a relationship that you can lean on of pastors who are more seasoned and experienced, staff teams that are really skilled and competent, when it comes to sound or media or whatever, and having those relationships that you can lean on, invaluable, even beyond the skill, competency, strategy that's developed during the residency. You have relationships that can carry you into those early seasons of church planning that not to be like, not to minimize what was going on with Moses and elevate what church planning is or isn't, but you have people to hold up your arms when they get tired.
Hmm.
And for us, yeah, you can't really say anything's been more valuable than that. That there's been times where I've reached out to you and said, I'm not sure I can keep doing this, and the encouragement I've got from you has at least kept me in the game and helped reorient our schedule and prioritize things that hopefully lead to healthier living. And so we're still figuring it out 8 years in, but having relationships, through that. And then the guys that have come out, even out of Cornerstone since then, like there's sweet fellowship that I have with Austin and Will. And hopefully they receive encouragement from me, but I certainly receive encouragement from them. Again, but that's a relational component that I think is oftentimes overlooked and undervalued when trying to get after the work of planting. If you want to stay in the work of planting, you got to have people around you.
That's a great statement. If you want to stay in the work of church planting, you got to have people around you. So if there's somebody listening to this, they haven't maybe finalized everything about what their church planting journey may look like, that maybe they're committed, and sometimes we all want to be ready, fire, aim. And the thought of delaying the process by a year or 2 years to do this kind of thing, I mean, that feels like a long time. In between, it's not, we understand, but it's not insignificant either. What would you say to a potential church planter and his family if they are considering a residency opportunity somewhere in the U.S.?
Yeah, I'll answer that question. Can I answer it this way though? If you're considering church planting and you don't want a residency, I would encourage you not to church plant. And the reason I say that is there are guys who've dropped into our city. They've burned up and burned out really fast. They had the solution to the complex problems of Seattle. They dropped in with their prospectus and their funding, and everything was really shiny and clean and put together. And I'm not trying to be patronizing, like competent, skilled, qualified, gifted individuals. I mean, like some of the best of the best that I've ever known, like wonderful people. But they dropped in without the community that's sending them and without the relationships in the city, and they burned up and they burned out really, really fast. If you're planting in an urban center, you're going to be surrounded by some of the most exceptional humans in their profession, that are on the planet right now, whether it's, New York and you got the financial sector, or Seattle and you got the tech sector, or you got, San Francisco and all the AI stuff going, like really exceptional people. And so I would say if you're not willing to be invested in from either a residency side or step into some sort of on the ground residency with a church that's already there, you're you're probably lacking the greatest, I don't know, the
Resource.
greatest resource. Yeah, the greatest resource that will lead to your personal health, family health, ministry health. And so that's my preface. So for the guy that's considering it, I would say yes and amen. And I would encourage them to not only have a church that's willing to send them and support them and encourage them, but when they get on the ground, build relationships with the guys that have already been there and are doing the work. I think our church planters that are going through assessment are highly qualified and, very skilled. The guys on the ground doing the work are also qualified and skilled. And I think sometimes, particularly in regions like Portland, Seattle, certainly some others, but I'm more familiar with Northwest, there's this impression that people have is if these guys were competent and skilled, the city would already be reached with the gospel. And so they kind of come in with a little bit of hubris and pride, saying, well, I got the strategy and I got the solution to the problems of the city. And I would just say, the guys on the ground doing the work are, uh, in my opinion, some of the most skilled, competent, um, strong men that I've ever been around, and they have my complete respect. And I've had the privilege of meeting some people over the course of my life. So, anyways, I'm rambling a little bit, but that's kind of my
Yeah,
thought on.
I think that's really helpful. I do think there's value in residence. Um, and I've often said, you've probably heard me say it, that the most important trait that you find in successful people is they're teachable. Like, you
Mhm.
cannot help somebody that already knows everything, and that person is doomed to fail ultimately.
Yeah.
So being teachable, I think, is huge, and I think you're touching on that. It's one of the things I've always appreciated about you as well. Despite the fact that you're obviously a super intelligent guy, you're still very much interested in learning, eager to learn, wanting to learn, and I think that's a beautiful thing. Well,
I
let's talk for
appreciate it.
just a second about how you landed in Seattle. At Cornerstone, traditionally, we have chosen to try to help plant churches in urban areas outside the South. So we've helped to plant churches in Boston and Phoenix, Seattle, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati. We're helping a church in South Queens Ferry on the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland, and some other places. How did you come to choose Seattle? You'll remember, like, we try to choose the resident and then help the resident, but primarily let the resident pick the place. So, how did you come to settle on Seattle?
Yeah, I think it does circle back around to the idea of stewardship. We have a life to steward. There were two things I was praying for when we planted a church. One, that we'd land in a city that was multi-ethnic, and would touch the nations. I have a heart for the nations. And being from the greater Northwest, I was praying for a city that the sun would shine in. And so one of those is spiritual, one of those is not so
Is
spiritual.
Miami, right? Like
So
Miami, the sun
my
shines.
it made perfect sense to me. It made perfect sense. And in God's kindness, Cornerstone elders gave us opportunity to go down to Miami and still have a deep relationship with those brothers, and have connected with the work in Colombia, South America, through the relationship with those brothers. So have tremendous respect for them. But we were cruising around the city, and they were talking about different places to plant, and they kept saying when hurricanes come, they go to the West Coast. And we'd drive a little bit more, and they say when hurricanes come, we go to the West Coast. And we drive around a little more. Third time they say that they go to the West Coast on hurricane season, I looked at them. I said, "Surely there's a place closer than the West Coast." And they're like, "No, the West Coast of the peninsula." And I'm like, "Okay, I'm in the wrong place, because that is not the West Coast. West Coast for me, being a Mountain West. I was born in Portland, raised Boise, Idaho. West Coast is clearly defined as Washington,
West.
Oregon, California.
Yes, that's right.
And so there were a lot of cultural nuances that, if God had led us there, we could have over 3, 5, 7 years adapted to the culture, much like missionaries do in a foreign context. In God's providence, we connected with a pastor who had been sent out by Cornerstone, planted in Bellevue on the east side of Seattle. And they were praying about a planter coming to Issaquah. And you had encouraged us to at least consider it. And I thought that was good wisdom. We come back to Seattle, and we start kind of touring the area. This is home to some of my cousins and aunts and uncles, and Portland's home to cousins and aunts and uncles. And so they're talking about Vancouver. And I asked, "Are you, Vancouver, British Columbia, or Vancouver, Washington?" Like, there was a cultural awareness
Mhm.
to the conversation, and the geography. And we kind of left that saying it's a city that touches the nations. And I tell people often, from what you drink, Starbucks, to how you shop, Amazon, to how you work, Microsoft, to how you travel, Boeing, like, Seattle touches every part of the world every single day. And so it is a city that touches the nations. It's a region that's familiar. And so my wife and I really looked at each other and said, we have roughly 30 years of life to steward. Would it be better stewarded by planting in Miami, or would it be better stewarded by planting on the east side of Seattle, and obviously the rest is history there. And God had gone before us, and there were some providential opportunities with some churches and partnerships up here that were meaningful. And so, yeah, thankful that we are where we are. Most days, there's a couple rainy days during winter where I think Miami sounds a little better, but overall, we know that we are where the Lord wants us.
And I think y'all made a very wise decision in that regard. Um, if it's God's will for us to be anywhere, He will use us in that place.
Yeah.
At the same time, God has willed our life circumstance too, including
Mm.
where we are raised and potentially places where we're most comfortable and best suited to plant a church. And so it's okay. I guess you would say it's okay to not rule a place out just because it's familiar or, you know, close to home. It may be that God had you in that space because He needs you in that space. What would you
Yeah.
say to the person thinking about that?
Yeah, no, I think I think when it comes to church planting, you need every tool you can get in the tool belt. And if one of the tools God providentially allows you to have in the tool belt is cultural awareness of a region or a city, that's to your benefit. So long as you use the tool. I think the other side of it is if you land in a city that you're familiar with and you have not been missional, we tend to be creatures of habit, and so we go back to what's familiar to us. And I think there can be some danger of someone who hasn't been missional in their community, in their city, saying, "I'm going to plant a church here. Now I'm going to become missional." And I'm going to leverage all these relationships that have had zero kind of gospel implication. You're probably going to be a little disappointed and find that you're planting the church with a different group of people than the ones that you think you're going to plant with. That being said, for us, it's been a tremendous benefit to know the region and the culture and be familiar with yeah, I mean the things that cause people to go back home when they plant from the south or the east coast in this area are the things that make this home for us. I mean, it's just we were raised with these types of ways of life that are nuanced to the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, I think that's super helpful. All right, well, we're winding down. I'm going to ask you two questions to close. You've been in the Seattle region 8 years now. The church is in a very healthy place, it seems to me, as we talk about that. And I'm sure that you can acknowledge that there's tremendous need for church planting in the Pacific Northwest, even though it's probably one of the hardest places in the U.S. to actually plant a church. Share some of the challenges that make church planting hard in the Pacific Northwest, and then how it is that people considering that, understanding the challenges that are there, can still find support and help to engage the work there.
I think the two big headwinds that families experience when they plant is culture and cost. And so the culture is not a Christian culture. In fact, some missiologists describe the Northwest as pre-Christian, not post-Christian. Northeast has obviously seen its spiritual revivals. The South has a strong gospel presence. California has even seen the Jesus movement, Azusa Street revivals, through kind of more charismatic Pentecostal, and even Calvary Chapel, which would be friendly. So we've seen unique gospel works in the Northeast, the South, and the California West Coast. The Northwest has never seen a spiritual revival or gospel movement. The culture is not indifferent towards the Christian faith, and in many ways is hostile towards the Christian faith. And so there's a cultural headwind that planters have to be prepared for. Depending on the pockets of our region, that's going to be stronger than maybe others. I got some dear brothers in North Seattle. They're experiencing different challenges than I'm experiencing on the East Side, and have tremendous respect for them and their faithfulness to the gospel and to God's word in the midst of some really challenging circumstances. I think there needs to be an awareness of the culture. I remember riding my bike with my family. I was talking to a guy before we planted the church, and I was sharing with him that we moved out here to plant a church, and bigger conversation than that, trying to give explanation on what that meant. And we got to the end of the conversation, and he just, I'd say politely, I don't know how polite it was. Tone, it was polite. Words, maybe not so polite. He said, "How are you going to teach your children to work if you don't work?" And I just kind of chuckled, and I was like, I need to rethink my pitch because that was not the landing that I thought it was going to be. And so, I mean, he didn't know church. He didn't know church planting. He was asking me where we're meeting. I was said we don't have a place yet. Like it was a really awful conversation when it came to my cultural awareness, even though I'm from this region. And so culture is a real thing. I think cost of living is a real thing too. I would encourage planters to consider that. That might mean your spouse needs to work. My wife works full time during the summer. Our whole family's, plugging away at different side jobs. Like it's the cost of doing business out here, unless you're working in the tech world and have stock options. I don't know of a church that gives stock options. If you do, then you're probably running in the wrong church lanes. But like there's not the same stream of income as your neighbors, and yet you're trying to reach your neighbors. And so there's got to be a hustle around that, and Jesus clearly says when it comes to discipleship to count the cost. And so, there is a financial cost, but there's also a familial cost. There's an emotional cost. And so I would just say to the planter, count the cost. And if the mission is still compelling enough to relocate to this region, then we would welcome you with open arms and encourage you to be teachable as you hit the ground.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And it's also just a good reminder that there are certain places in the world where it just costs a lot more money to plant a church. And you got to have more partners. They have to make a longer financial commitment. It's just different.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it's impossible, but it takes a lot more collaboration and cooperation. And that's where a network like Pillar can be beneficial
Yeah.
in, connecting like-minded churches to embrace some of these incredibly hard spots where it takes a long-term commitment among partners
For sure.
to keep the church afloat while it has the opportunity to get established in a community. I think that's valuable for
Can
sure.
can I speak to that real quickly?
Yeah.
And I run out of time. I would say to that person too, when you build your partnerships, make sure that they're bought into you planting the church. I've seen so many guys come out here with a good amount of partners and outside dollars, and they spend a good 2 or 3 months out of the year traveling to their partner churches to, be the face at their missions weekend, and whatever it is that they got to do. And I'm like, man, you came out here to plant a church, and you're only here 3/4 of the year. Like, how are you going to shepherd the church that God's bringing to you if you're not present? And so, it isn't it is the financial component, but it's also the vision piece of like we're releasing you to the work. And that doesn't mean that there's not relationship that's built. I mean, Cornerstone's been so gracious to us to release us to the work, and we try to be intentional at maintaining a relationship. But you're not demanding we come back every year for multiple weeks at a time, and that's been to the benefit of the local church that you've tasked us with planting.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important too to consider that when folks think about planting in the Pacific Northwest, there are a lot of stories of guys who've planted and maybe the church hasn't survived to maturity to a point where it was self-sustaining. And lots of things impact that. Sometimes it's an issue with partners. Sometimes there's a strategic need in the family. Like there's lots of reasons. Um, and I think it's important for us to remind church planners, no matter where they are, that God's sovereign over the ultimate outcome of the plant that we're serving, and that even if we have an opportunity and it doesn't succeed in the way that maybe we envisioned, it doesn't mean that the work that's been invested has been a failure, or that somehow the ministry that was accomplished was produced no positive outcomes in the city or the location where they were. How would you add anything to that, especially when you think about your own context?
Yeah, I think I think we oftentimes take our church context and we project it to another place. Historically, when we send missionaries to unreached or underreached regions, it's usually that second or third generation that experiences the greatest spiritual fruit of that first missionary that went. And so that missionary, the imagery in scripture is a farmer, right? He's preparing the ground, he's sowing the seed. He goes to sleep. How the plant grows, he does not know. Kind of Mark 4 language. And what soil it lands on, he doesn't know. He's just liberally sowing the seed, and three of the four, it doesn't bear good fruit. And I think the perspective we've tried to cast for our church is that our prayer is that our children and our grandchildren experience the greatest fruit of our ministry. That's a tricky mindset for a sending church or a supporting church, because we're oftentimes looking for missional wins for our congregation. And I think it's the task of the pastor who's sending the church planter and missionary to reframe the vision for the church, saying we're investing in not just this generation. It's certainly going to sow seeds in this generation, but we're really investing in the generation of our kids and our grandkids, which means the fruit of what's invested isn't going to be fully experienced or realized until much further down the road. I think that takes some of the pressure off of some of these immediate demonstrations of, is God with you or not? And it just says, be faithful to the work, go get after the work, and trust God to bring a harvest in his time. And I think our church has experienced the fruit of probably a number of pastors who've gone before us and worked the ground and sown the seed, and we're getting to experience the reward of that in many respects. But I hope our kids and our grandkids experience that to a much greater degree, and so but that sending church and supporting church, that's a different perspective,
Yeah.
because we want to give a highlight on the weekend of what our money is going to do in this part of the world. And I get that as a pastor who's trying to raise support for mission partners, but I think we've got to cast a bigger vision to our church and call them to sacrifice, even when we don't necessarily see immediate fruit from that sacrifice.
Yeah, that's a good word. I think, guys who shepherd existing churches, and maybe they're there for a number of years and a couple things happen that they would feel good about, but potentially they could be at a church 3 or 4 years and not see as much movement as they'd like, and maybe God moves them somewhere else. They don't generally look back at that and say, well, I failed while I was there. But when it comes to church planting, I've met guys through the years who God led to plant a church and they poured themselves into it. And for whatever reason, in God's providence, the church didn't succeed long term, and they really feel like they've failed at some level. And I don't know if the church planting movement has created that kind of mindset, because the reality is true for both. If you've been faithful to what God asked you to do, then it is just the farmer. Like at the end of the day, God's growing stuff and he's building stuff, but none of the work and none of the seed casting has been wasted.
Yeah.
It's all being used of God, even if in my particular context, I didn't see the fruit of that myself.
Yeah.
And I hope if anyone's listening who maybe falls into that category, that they would be encouraged to know that, hey, faithfulness is the thing, and
Yeah,
that's what God's paying attention to.
for sure. Well, and I think if I could speculate, I think the reason we feel like we've failed at church planting is because we're sending out church planters. And so if there's no church planted, then it stands to reason that we've failed at the task. I think the right perspective on a church planter is they're being sent as missionaries, and they're being tasked with planting a church through that missional engagement. But we wouldn't if we sent someone to an underreached part of the world and they served faithfully for 5, 10, 15 years, and there was no local church planted, but there was gospel seed sown, we would celebrate that.
Yes.
And I remember looking in the mirror one day and saying, "Am I a missionary? Am I a church planter? Or am I a pastor?" And I just kind of smiled at myself. I'm like, I don't know what I am, but I'm here to do the thing.
I'm
And
here.
I've come,
I'm a faithful farmer, man. That's what I
yeah,
am. We got to be a
yeah.
faithful farmer.
And I think that's a healthy perspective as you step into the thing. Say, go as a missionary, sow the seeds, and take some swings at planting a church, and trust God with building His kingdom.
I love that. All right, one final thing. We'll get you out of here on this. Uh, what would you say to the planter and his wife who are in the early years of a plant, maybe year 1, 2, even 3,
Mm,
and they're coming to grips with the amount of work and sacrifice that's actually required
yeah.
to do this thing, and maybe are growing a little weary in the journey? What would be your encouragement to them?
Yeah, there's a lot of thoughts that come to mind. I think that the greatest encouragement I could give is the greatest reward in life, in church planting, in marriage, in parenting is after the hard work. It's not before it.
Mm.
And when you step into marriage, there's kind of this honeymoon phase, and I think that's a fair depiction of church planting. You get sent out to church plant, everyone's so excited for you, and you're fresh on everybody's mind, and finances are in place through partners, and the place that you live is new, and the place that you're shopping, and everything's just it's exciting. It's a new city. At 2, 3 years in, all that newness wears off, and it's just hard. 4 or 5 years in, 6 years in, 7 years in, it's just hard. I think the greatest rewards in life come after the hard work, and God has given us so many natural examples in which that is true. I think in His grace, He's given us those natural examples where that's true, so that we can apply those principles to the spiritual places in life, knowing that it's post the hard work and spiritual things that we get to experience the greatest reward and fruit. And an example of that is, I think post COVID's King County was so restrictive. We've seen more people come to faith in the last couple of years than we have the previous 6 years. And that's not unique to our church. Many pastors in this region have seen more people come to faith in the last couple of years than the previous however many years they've been serving. But you had to get through COVID and the restrictions and the complexities and the church division and all the things that, and the governor saying you can't sing, and what do you do with that? Leading your church in civil disobedience or not, like those, that's complicated. And, I oftentimes kind of grieve a little bit for all those faithful saints who were working the ground and left just before kind of the sweetness of the harvest. I'm thankful to be in a position where we're here for kind of a sweetness of the harvest. And I'm thankful for the other guys that get to be encouraged by that too. But it's post the hard work.
That's encouraging. But the Bible reminds us, do not grow weary in well doing, for in due season you will reap if you don't give up. So the farmer, he's just sowing. He's got to keep sowing and trusting in the Lord of the harvest. Well, Will, thanks for taking some time to chat. I know that your thoughts will be encouraging. Look forward to being out with you in September, see what God's doing there, and be a part of a fun weekend. We're looking forward to that. And but give everybody our love, and thanks again for being on the Ministry Think Tank.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you.